The Trump campaign is in the courts, the Biden campaign is moving forward with its transition, and the cable news industry is trying to find out how to navigate the waters moving forward. It's not only a matter of how to cover this current moment, but about what comes next, whether it be another 4 years of President Trump or the prospect of a Biden-Harris administration. Here to help us make some sense of these developments is Adam Guillette, the president of the media watchdog group, Accuracy Media. Adam, thanks once again for joining us tonight.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Of course, it's always a pleasure. So let's dive right into it, beginning with CNN's Christiane Amanpour. It's a tough one to get right into. She was very quick to criticize the president for his decision to fight the election results, but after comparing him to Hitler, she had to issue this apology.
And finally tonight, a comment on my program at the end of last week. I observed the 82nd anniversary of Kristallnacht, as I often do. It's the event that began the horrors of the Holocaust. I also noted President Trump's attacks on history, facts, knowledge and truth. I shouldn't have juxtaposed the two thoughts. Hitler and his evil stand alone in history, and I regret any pain that my statement may have caused. My point was to say how democracy can potentially slip away and how we must always zealously guard our democratic values.
So it's never a good idea to compare anyone to Hitler, but from your experience, has opposition media always been this hostile, or is this entering a new realm of polarization?
Well, I feel like the left-wing media has been calling Republicans literally Hitler since literally Hitler. However, each time they kind of ramp it up a bit. Obviously, 10 years ago, we were hearing how Bush and Cheney were war criminals and they were literally Hitler. Before that, Nixon got horrible treatment. And before that, of course, we were told that Goldwater was going to start World War III. To make sure that their attacks don't grow tired, each time they ramp them up, I can't even imagine what it'll be like next time.
Yeah, and I think it's actually a disservice because when you make everybody the next Hitler, for example, I mean, you look the other way, for example, when there actually is something legitimate. It's a crying wolf type of situation to a very large degree, especially when you turn it on and it's just constant outrage all the time. But there are questions to how the media would treat, on the other hand, a potential Biden-Harris administration. I liked the way that Louisiana Senator John Kennedy described what he thinks the role of a journalist should be. Let's take a look at that.
And the role of a journalist is to hold those politicians accountable and to ferret out and safeguard the truth. And in doing so, journalists can't pick sides. Otherwise, they're not seeking out the truth. They've got to be equal opportunity a-holes, if you will. Yes. And too many of our journalists have started picking sides, and it will ultimately undermine their profession and democracy, because without truth, there is no trust. Without trust, there is no democracy.
I mean, what he's saying seems pretty indisputable to me, but I want to ask you, is he right? Is that what the role of a journalist is? And do you suspect that's how they will treat a possible Biden administration?
Well, he put it incredibly well. That's what we expect from journalists. We want them to report the facts, cover things equally, and quote unquote speak truth to power. But instead, as you know, and as you report on, these days we have activist journalists who cheer for one side, and then we have fan fiction journalists who write stories they know to be untrue simply because they know it will sell with their readers. I don't expect the media to be impartial with Biden. I expect them to give him a free pass for quite some time, unless and until he actually governs like a moderate. If he governs like a moderate and there becomes a challenge to him from the left and it looks like he's going to get a primary challenger, all of a sudden the knives will be out for Biden and you'll see them discard him like anything. He'll be gone.
That's really interesting because I could actually see that happening as well. And I heard something else in that interview that I just want to point out. It used to be the cool thing for journalists to be the one challenging government, asking the hard questions, really pressing those who are in power. But it is a little bit of a weird moment where we see some of those who are supposed to be doing what I just said, appeasing those who are actually in power, trying to suck up to them in a way. It's a little bit of a weird time, and I think it's a problematic time as well because, I mean, journalists are supposed to be the ones holding those people to account. But we see different realities on certain issues, on different networks as well, such as the recent announcement regarding vaccine production. That's one that stuck out to me, where some personalities just get away saying false information and go completely unchecked. So I want to show MSNBC's Joy Reid talking about that subject, and then to be fact-checked by CNN. Here that is.
I just want to fact check real quick to remind y'all that the companies themselves that are producing these vaccines were not involved in Operation Warp Speed and have said as much. So that's a lie.
The Moderna vaccine was done with funds from Operation Warp Speed, and the Pfizer one has funding when it comes to the distribution and manufacture. And I just think it's important that people working so hard, Moncef Slaoui and the others, get credit for this. And President Trump was the one who okayed it.
So her fact check, by the way, was not the accurate one. And then Jake Tapper kind of laid out the details of why it was part of Operation Warp Speed. But is this the problem with the media? People, for example, they have their outlets they go to. Many of those on the left go to NBC. Many of those on the right go to Fox. And they don't get challenged because they don't have the differing viewpoints on those outlets?
Well, that's what I say. That's what I mean when I say fan fiction journalism. They're reporting stories that may or may not be true simply because they know that's what their audience wants to hear. She tries to make the case that the Trump administration, Operation Warp Speed, was not involved at all in Pfizer's vaccine. And the facts simply don't support that. She's politicizing a vaccine that's going to save hundreds of thousands of American lives. She's literally putting politics before the life or death of her fellow Americans. It's disgusting.
Yeah, and I remember there was a time where it was declared to be misinformation. If you said anything wrong about coronavirus, if you said anything about a vaccine, that clip would have been pulled, for example, from the media, from YouTube, whatever it was posted on at the early days of the coronavirus pandemic. But here we are now, and it seems like President Trump actually got the time frame pretty right when he was talking about the vaccine coming out around the election. People said that was fake news back then, and now here we are. We're looking at a time where there's multiple vaccines seemingly coming out in the near future. And I brought up social media there, and we can't talk about the media without talking about Tuesday's hearing with Silicon Valley tech giants. Those from Twitter and Facebook appeared before lawmakers. So I want to play what was perhaps the most substantive comment from Senator Lindsey Graham regarding that issue. Let's play that clip.
My hope is that we change Section 230 to incentivize social media platforms to come up with standards that are transparent and opaque that will allow us to make judgments about their judgments, that the fact checkers be known, that the community standards, who sets them, what are their biases, and give some direction to these companies because they have almost an impossible task.
So I think for many Republicans, that's kind of the crux of this whole argument is Section 230, whether or not these social media companies should have liability protection, if they're actually a publisher, things of that nature. So I think that's really what it comes down to. But what were your takeaways from those hearings? Are we all good now that that hearing took place? We're all good when it comes to social media?
His words strike fear in my heart, and they should strike fear in the hearts of any conservatives. When he says the government should be setting direction for the internet, that's terrifying. Think about the people who typically control government. Do you want Nancy Pelosi setting direction for social media companies? Think about the age of politicians. They're basically your grandparents. Do you think your grandparents are wise enough about social media to effectively regulate it? The proper solution isn't more government involvement. The proper solution is competition. Accuracy in Media first identified media bias 50 years ago. We spent decades convincing people and exposing media bias, and as a result, we got the proliferation of talk radio, the internet, and all sorts of alternative news sources. That's what we need for social media, competition, not government regulation.
So that's really interesting because this is actually a divide, I think, that is happening on the right now. There's a lot of more, I would call them libertarian-minded people who say that exactly what you're saying. This should be handled with a free market approach. Why have, for example, give the government more control over the battle for information that's taking place over the internet? But then there are many, I'll call them conservatives, maybe not as libertarian, who say, you know what, though, we need to be able to have our battles on these platforms because nowadays this essentially is the public square. Do you think that's the right way to frame that argument when it comes to those two sides?
Any power you give to government, you have to imagine the people you hate most ideologically using it against you. And the most powerful communication tool in the history of mankind, the internet, is not a power I would trust with a politician, even one I entirely like. As I said, best case scenario, they'll be typical politicians. They'll be inept. Worst case scenario, imagine the AOCs of the world using their control over social media to advance their agenda and block the viewpoints of others. It's truly terrifying.
I think it's a good point, because once you do concede that power, no matter what issue it is, I mean, I remember thinking about this when Democrats were talking about packing the court. I mean, they may have the House, for example. There's a chance that they get the White House and the Senate. But what happens, for example, then when Republicans are in power, just like they were in 2016 when they had the House, the Senate, and the White House as well? Can they just put 100 judges on the court then and say, all right, well, from this point forward, this is the number and we're going to deal with it? I think you're exactly right that we have to look through this with a very clear mindset, to put the politics to the side and know that no matter where you stand politically, you're not always going to be in power. I think that's very well said. Adam Guillette, it's always a pleasure having you on this program. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.